Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get it on. Get it on. Coming at you from a secret backwoods location in the middle of Texas. It's the highly opinionated and controversial voice of traditional old-school Orthodox Christianity. This is Spiritual Combat with Dr. Scott Sullivan.
Hello, and welcome to Spiritual Combat, the show where we engage the enemy using prayer, fasting, and full contact logic on the front lines and in the trenches, inviting you to join the resistance against the forces of lies, error, and evil. I am your host, Scott Sullivan, and welcome to the show. All right, today I want to talk about something you may have never heard of before, but it's a commonly cited issue in the spiritual life, and it's called the predominant fault. The predominant fault. And what this is it's your main problem. Your main spiritual problem is your predominant fault. Now, if you're like me, you have a whole lot of problems. You have a whole lot of spiritual problems, defects. You fall into venial sins. Hopefully you're not falling into mortal sins, but maybe you are, and maybe you're struggling with that too. But even if you're beyond that, you still have a predominant fault. That is, amongst all your faults, you have one that really stands out the most, the one you fall into the most, the defect in you that tends to prevail over all of the others. That's your biggest problem. And it's important to know what that is. You know, we can get caught up, I think, when we're trying to become closer to Christ and become holier and so on. If you're like me, again, you've got so many problems, it's hard to know which one to work on. And you end up working on all of them at once. And that leads to a diversification of resources. You know, and that just doesn't work that well. It's much better to focus on the big problem. You know, it's kind of like when you go into your house and you see a huge mess, and you're like, oh, gosh, I don't know where to start. The mess is everywhere. Well, a good way to start is start with the biggest mess. So that's what we're doing here when we're talking about your predominant fault, is we're starting with the biggest mess in your soul. This is your main spiritual weak spot, you know, your Achilles heel that is undefended by any virtue. It's a chink in your armor. And this usually comes from our temperament, depending on what kind of person we are, what our temperament is. If you're kind of a gentle person, you probably have a predominant fault of being effeminate in some way. Or just the opposite. If you tend to be very, you know, your main virtue is courageous, you probably go overboard sometime and become irascible, something like that. But nevertheless, the predominant fault is a good thing to know because it just simplifies your path towards holiness. Pick out the main problem, deal with it, hammer it, get rid of it, knock it out of your soul, all right? And then once that's gone, then move on to the next one. It really simplifies our spiritual progress, I think. Knock out the biggest fault. When that one's done, move to the next. But don't expend your energies on everything at once. That's a trap that we can fall into. So your predominant fault is something we need to know. It's like it's been described as a devouring worm in a beautiful fruit. Nice looking fruit, but you got this nasty worm in there. And you probably have many worms, but let's just get the biggest worm out of there first. That's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about two things regarding the predominant fault. Number one, how to recognize it. And number two, how to combat it. So, two-step process to getting rid of our predominant fault. And by the way, I am following one of the greatest spiritual writers of the 20th century, Father Gary Lagrange, who wrote this massive 2-volume work called The Three Ages of the Interior Life. I highly recommend it, but it's an intimidating read. It's just 2 books. I think this thing's about, let me just look here. It's about, it's about 1,000 pages, So great work. It's a big thing to take on, but I highly recommend it if you are inclined to do so. Nevertheless, this discussion here today regarding the predominant fault follows Father Gary Lagrange's work. So first, how can we recognize this predominant fault? Well, there are a few things to follow here. Number 1 is through prayer, you ask God's help. We ask God for light here. Lord, what is my main sin? What is my main problem? Please give me light, Lord. Something like this. To ask God to show you what this spiritual Achilles heel is. So that's the first thing, is to ask God's help. Second thing is to ask yourself, what am I preoccupied with? What do I think about most of the time that is sinful in some way? So this would involve some introspection into yourself, you see, and ask yourself, what is it that I seem to be preoccupied with mentally? In the morning, when I wake up, when I'm alone, where do my thoughts and desires tend to go? So that's the second thing, is to think about what you're mentally preoccupied with in a sinful sort of way. The third thing is you can ask yourself, what is it that motivates my sinful actions? When you go and commit a sin, when you think of all the sins you've committed, what's the main motivation behind all those? It's kind of like the root or the mother of all your evil actions here. See, the foundation, the principal motivation behind most of your sinful actions. If you can think of that, that will help uncover this large worm in your soul. A fourth thing you can do to discover your predominant fault is to ask your spiritual director. Ask the person who you go to for spiritual counseling. What is it that you think I fall into the most? Now, if you don't have a spiritual director, ask your spouse. I'm sure she or he is more than happy to tell you what your predominant fault is. And we have to be honest here. We have to open ourselves up a little bit, I think, right? To being hurt, to being offended in some way. When you go around asking someone, what do you think my main fault is? Prepare yourself. You're not going to like the answer no matter how it goes, probably. So there's some humility called for here, but that, hey, that's essential for the spiritual life. You got to have humility. The proud man's not going to get anywhere. So you're going to open yourselves up a little bit, I think, on this one, but it's for your own good. A fifth way to recognize your predominant fault is to ask yourself, where am I tempted at the most by the enemy? Where do I feel tempted the most? We're looking for these temptations that our enemy arouses most frequently in us, because they know your weak spot. The demonic spirits are highly intelligent, and they know your Achilles heel. They know where you are undefended by virtue, you see. It's like, imagine, I used to be in the fight game a lot. Say you're a boxer and your opponent's watching your videos of all your fights, and he knows, this guy, he's always dropping his right hand. He's setting himself up for a left hook. That's how we're going to get him. Well, you do have opponents here, and they are watching the video of your character, and they know where you drop your hands, you see. So this is another very important reason for knowing your predominant fault, because your principal spiritual opponents do. They probably know it better than you do, and they're going to hit you on your weak spot, you see. You got to know your weak spots because your enemy does. So ask yourself, this is number 5 now, where am I tempted at the most from my enemy? So I think if you do these things, if you, number 1, ask God's help, number 2, ask yourself what you're preoccupied with the most, what you think about the most, number 3, inquire into what it is that motivates your sinful actions, number 4, get your director's opinion or your spouse's opinion, number 5, ask what you are tempted into by the enemy the most. If you pay attention to those sorts of things and seek inspiration from the Holy Spirit, I think you will go a long way into recognizing your predominant fault. And by the way, here, I just be honest with you, I practice what I preach here. I do this myself. I've done this for myself. And as the head of my family, I've done it for my family members. Everybody's different. I've got my predominant fault that I'm working on for this year. I do this as a kind of a yearly thing. You have 12 months hammering out my main fault, and then, gosh, if I do this for 10 years, you've knocked out 10 faults. That's pretty good. That's the way I look at it. So I'm working on it, and then I'm also working on it with my family too. So I'll take each one of my kids has their own problem, different ones, different personalities, and so on. So I go through each one, and we work on those, and hopefully after the course of several years, we will have hammered out several predominant faults. So that's how I do it. I'm just sharing, what I do with you, so that you can, if you find that helpful, you can incorporate that into your own lives. So that, anyway, is how I would say you can recognize your predominant fault. Just in case you're listening and not able to write these down. Number 1, ask God's help. Number 2, ask yourself what you're preoccupied with. Number 3, ask yourself what motivates your sinful actions. Number 4, get your director's opinion, or if you don't have one, a spouse. Number 5, ask yourself, where are you, in what area are you tempted the most by the enemy? So that's how we recognize our predominant fault. Let's talk now about how we're going to combat it. So we know what our predominant fault is. All right, I got this problem, bang. All right, so you've isolated the problem. How do we eradicate that fault out of our soul? And here I recommend you following 3 steps. Number 1, again, prayer. We always start with prayer. That's the principle of all graces in the spiritual life. We have to first pray and get God's help. Lord, help me overcome blank, fill in the blank, with your predominant fault. You see, so find some kind of prayer that you like to use here. That's number 1 in combating the predominant fault. Number 2, I highly recommend this as well, is the daily examination of conscience. You pick out a time every day to do this, whether it's in the morning or I think it's best to do it at night before you go to bed. You examine your conscience. You go through the day mentally, all right, and we ask ourselves, how well did I combat my predominant fault today? In other words, how well did I practice the opposite virtue? This is a good way to kind of do this on a case-by-case basis. When this predominant fault comes up, it's kind of like bending the stick back the other way. If you've got a stick that's bent, say to the left, and it's just kind of bent that way, a good way to straighten the stick out is to go to the extreme and bend it back to the right so it ends up being straight. You know what I mean? So when you have a predominant fault, you practice the opposite virtue. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose your predominant fault is gluttony. You eat too much. And this is a very common problem today because we have so much food, so much good junk food, widely available. It's cheap. We don't have to go scrounging for food or anything. It's just right here at the store. You can just pull it off the shelf. It's cheap. And people fall into this sin of gluttony. Their God is their bellies. And so this is one of those sins that you can kind of see just by getting on the scale sometimes. If you are very overweight, you are probably guilty of this sin. So if you have this sin, say of gluttony, the best way to combat that is to practice the opposite virtue, temperance. All right? Put the fork down and push away from the table. You see, you do table push-aways. That's the best way to lose weight in the world. I know the weight loss industry is a billion-dollar industry, but the answer is very simple. Table push-aways. Push yourself away from the table, you will lose weight. Quit getting seconds. Quit overeating, you see. So we combat the predominant fault by practicing the opposite virtue. Nevertheless, that's what we're doing in that daily examination of conscience. By the way, this is the particular examination of conscience. Every night, ask yourself, how many times did I fall into my predominant fault today? Now, St. Ignatius of Loyola says, write them down. I mean, you literally keep a tally sheet, 3, 4, whatever. But you literally write these down. I mean, most of us have some sort of, balance or financial budget, right? Where we keep track of dollars for financial reasons. Well, isn't the spiritual life more important than that? Wouldn't it be more important to keep a spiritual balance or a spiritual budget and find out where your debits are every day? That's what I'm talking about here. All right, so by the way, this is the particular examination of conscience. You should also do a general examination of conscience where you go over all the sins. How many times did I fall into all the other different sins today? That's the general examination. But a particular examination of conscience is just where you're looking for that one thing, that big worm. How many times did I fall into that thing today? And then after you do that, you can do a brief general examination where you look at all the other sins that you may have fallen into. But again, we are focusing here on the big one. So that's number 2 in combating our predominant fault, is an examination of conscience. Now finally, number 3, this is the big one, is you got to impose a sanction. There has to be some sort of payment or some kind of painful thing involved every time you fall into that predominant fault. So again, to use our example, if your predominant fault is gluttony and you just overdid it on lunch today. I mean, the boss took me out to lunch and he was buying and you just ate too much. You fell into your predominant fault of gluttony. There has to be some sort of sanction or penance involved. A penalty. All right, every time I fall into my predominant fault of gluttony, I am going to do 20 minutes on the treadmill. Or I'm going to say this long prayer. Whatever it is, some sort of sanction or penance where you got to pay up. You got to make it painful in some way to fall into, to commit your predominant fault. Fall into your predominant fault. You got to make it painful in some way. Else, you're never going to get out of it. It's got to have a price tag if you really are serious about wiping this thing out. So that's it. That is the method for both recognizing your predominant fault and then, number 2, combating it. Just for summary again, so you'll have it in your head. Number 1, we recognize our predominant fault by asking God's help. Number 2, we ask ourselves what we are preoccupied with most of the time. Number 3, ask ourselves what motivates our sinful actions. When we look at all of our sins, what is the root motivation there? Number 4, we ask our director's opinion, or if you don't have one, ask your spouse what they think your predominant fault is. Number 5, look into our souls and see where our enemy tempts us the most and pay attention to those inspirations of the Holy Spirit. Now, to combat the predominant fault, number 1, of course, we use prayer. We ask for God's help. Number 2, we do that daily examination, that particular examination of conscience every night before you go to bed. How many times did I fall into X? All right. And finally, number 3, on combating our predominant fault, impose that sanction. Make it painful in some way to fall into your predominant fault. That's all we have time for today, folks. This is Scott Sullivan. Visit us on the web at www.scottmsullivan.com, where I have some more resources for you regarding Christian faith and apologetics, theology, and things of that nature. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. You can do that there on iTunes, or you can do it on your Droid device. Any device you have, you can subscribe to our podcast. That way you'll be notified when the next one comes out. I look forward to talking to you in the next episode of Spiritual Combat.
In your face with grace. You're listening to Spiritual Combat. Hardcore Catholic Radio. With Dr. Scott Sullivan. www.scottmsullivan.com.